Let's talk about team conflict. It's that one thing that can just completely derail even the most amazing projects. But what if I told you conflict isn't actually a problem you need to avoid? What if it's a signal, one you just need to learn how to decode? Well, in this explainer, we're going to give you the field guide to do just that, to turn those disputes you dread into your team's very next breakthrough.
This one idea, it changes everything. Seriously. Conflict isn't about difficult people. It's almost always about a system failure. Just think of it like a flashing red light on your car's dashboard. The light isn't the problem, right? It's just a signal telling you, hey, something's wrong with the engine. And your job as a leader isn't to get mad at the light. It's to pop the hood and see what's really going on.
Okay, so that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If all of this conflict is just a signal, how in the world do you learn to read it? Well, that's exactly what we're about to dive into. Think of this as your personal guide for decoding those signals, and more importantly, turning all that friction into actual forward progress.
Now, before we get into any specific tactics or scripts, we have to start with your mindset, because this requires a pretty fundamental shift in how you see your role. Look, your goal isn't to be a peacekeeper who smooths everything over and avoids tension. No, your goal is to be a facilitator who actually brings that tension out into the open so you can channel it into a real resolution.
So every time conflict pops up, you're standing at a fork in the road. On one side, you've got the blame game. That's the tangled mess of emotions, finger-pointing. It goes absolutely nowhere. But on the other side, you have the solution mindset. And this is all about shifting the conversation away from who did this and toward, okay, how do we fix this? It means focusing on facts and goals, not just feelings. And that's where all the progress is.
All right, enough theory. Let's get into the practical stuff. We're going to break down 3 of the most common conflicts you're likely to face, and I'll give you a step-by-step playbook for handling each one.
First up, a real classic, the so-called problem employee. You know the one I'm talking about, the person who seems to argue with everyone about everything. But if you look a little closer, you might realize they're not actually fighting the people on the team, they're fighting the process. Their frustration is a huge signal that something in your system just feels broken, inefficient, or maybe even unfair to them.
So what's the playbook here? It's actually pretty simple. First, you get them into a one-on-one. You need to understand the specifics of their frustration. Then you clearly define what can be changed and what can't, what's set in stone. And then, this is the most important part, you invite them to help you fix what's broken. You literally turn all that frustrated energy into constructive, problem-solving energy.
Let me give you a perfect real-world example. Say you have a developer who's always pushing back on Jira tickets. Now, the issue probably isn't their attitude, it's that the requirements are too vague and it's causing them a ton of frustrating rework. So, what's the solution? You don't discipline the developer, instead you work with them to refine the task template for everyone. See? You fix the system, not the person.
Okay, on to scenario 2. This is another classic you see all the time, especially in tech. The ongoing battle between developers and QA. It's almost like one team is building a sandcastle and the other team's job is to try and kick it over. It's a natural setup for tension, right? You hear accusations like, "You're being way too picky," or "You keep shipping broken code."
Your role here is absolutely crucial. You have to be a mediator, not a judge. Your job is to pull the conflict out of that emotional swamp and get it onto solid, rational ground. You start by gathering the facts from each person separately in one-on-ones. Then you bring them together for a joint meeting. But there's one firm rule. We only discuss the facts. And finally, and this is so important, you formalize whatever you agree on. You write it down so there's zero ambiguity later on.
So for instance, let's say that QA tester and developer are just constantly at each other's throats. In that joint meeting, they don't waste time debating who's right. Instead, they create a simple, objective checklist that defines what officially counts as a bug. They agree on a better format for bug reports. And suddenly, the argument isn't personal anymore. It's just about following a clear, shared process they built together.
All right, this is the final boss of conflict management. This is the big one. What happens when you're actually part of the problem? Maybe you made a decision, it backfired, and now someone on your team is upset directly with you. Your position of authority just makes the situation incredibly tricky to handle.
Look, in this situation, your number one priority is preserving trust. So the playbook starts with a critical first move. If things are getting heated, you have to hit the pause button. Just stop the conversation. Agree to pick it up a little later when things are calm. When you do reconvene, you focus only on the facts, you acknowledge the impact of your actions, and you own your mistake. Then you pivot to the most important question of all. How do we change the process so this never happens again? That is how you build real, lasting psychological safety. Just imagine you make a big planning decision without talking to a key specialist on your team, and now they're completely buried in work. They come to you, and they're not happy. Your first instinct might be to get defensive, right? But the right move is to just admit the mistake, help fix the workload, and then create a new rule. From now on, specialists are always consulted on these decisions. You don't just repair the trust you damaged, you actually upgrade your entire team's process for the better.
Okay, so we've covered the scenarios, we've got the playbooks, but how do you actually have these tough conversations without things just blowing up? Well, that's where this next tool comes in. Seriously, think of this as your secret weapon, the pro move for handling really tense dialogue.
It's a technique called nonviolent communication, or NVC. And I know, the name might sound a little out there for a business setting, but trust me, it's an incredibly powerful framework. At its core, it's just a structured way to state your case without making the other person feel attacked, which helps turn a heated argument into a calm, rational discussion.
It all boils down to a pretty simple 4-step formula. Step 1 is observation, just the objective facts. Last week, 2 code reviews took more than 3 days. Step 2 is feelings. How did that fact impact you? Because of that delay, I feel really tense about making our deadline. 3 is needs. What's the underlying value at stake? It's important that I can accurately predict our timelines. And finally, step 4, the request. A clear, specific ask. Can we agree to a 1-day turnaround for any high-priority reviews? See how that works? No blame, just facts, feelings, needs, and a request. It's a game changer.
So far, we've spent a lot of firefighting, and that's super important. But the truly great leaders, they aren't just good at putting out fires. They're more like architects. They design a system where fires rarely even start in the first place. So let's talk about fire prevention.
Your most powerful prevention tool is probably the one you're already doing, the simple one-on-one meeting. Think of this as your early warning system. It's a dedicated, low-stakes space where people feel safe enough to bring up the small issues, the little annoyances. It's where you can pick up on those tiny blips of tension long before they have a chance to escalate into a full-blown crisis.
Second tool for prevention, team agreements. This is where you actually sit down as a group and write down all those unwritten rules. You know, how do we give each other feedback? How do we make big decisions? What's our official policy on Slack interruptions? By making the implicit explicit, you eliminate this massive source of conflict that just comes from people having mismatched expectations.
And finally, prevention tool number 3, the retrospective. This is a dedicated meeting where the team gets to ask what went wrong. But there's one critical, non-negotiable rule. You discuss what went wrong with the process, never the people. This is so powerful because it gives the team a safe space to honestly critique and improve its own system of work. You turn potential grievances into collaborative upgrades.
So let's end with this. The next time conflict starts to bubble up on your team, and trust me, it will, I want you to try something. Your first reaction shouldn't be frustration, it should be curiosity. I want you to see it not as a problem with a person, but as a piece of data about your system. And ask yourself the question on this slide. What is this conflict trying to tell me? Because the answer to that question just might unlock your team's next big breakthrough.